Hello, everybody, and welcome to History of the President. I'm Brian Batesman, editor-in-chief of The Intellectualist and host of History of the President. It's a long-form interview series co-produced with Lincoln Square about the forces reshaping our world and the history that brought us to this moment. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Ambassador Jan Eliasson. Ambassador Eliasson's career has included some of the highest offices in Swedish and United Nations diplomacy. He served as Sweden's ambassador to the United Nations and later as Sweden's ambassador to the United States. He was president of the 60th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Sweden's foreign minister, the first United Nations Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, the UN Secretary General Special Envoy for Darfur, and from 2012 through the end of 2016, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Earlier in his career, he participated in United Nations mediation during the Iran-Iraq War and served as the Secretary General's personal representative for Iran and Iraq. All of those roles are documented in the United Nations official biography of Ambassador Eliasson. Ambassador Eliasson was born in Gothenburg, Sweden in 1940, before the end of the Second World War. In 1957 and 1958, Ambassador spent time in the United States as an exchange student. The United Nations documents both his birth in 1940 and 1957-58, experiencing life as an American teenager. So Ambassador Eliasson has lived through almost the entire history of the post-war international system and later served at the highest level of the UN and Swedish diplomacy. Today, we see a system that's being tested by war, great power rivalry, pressure on long-standing alliances, and political freedom, now dominated by stories of democratic erosion. Ambassador Eliasson, thank you very much for joining me. I want to begin with the world you were born into. What was the world of 1940, sir?
Well, I have no active recollection of that, but my parents were deeply influenced, of course, and my father was politically extremely interested. He was a labor union man. And I remember he put me in his lap at age 5 at the end of the war, when the troops from the Soviet Union and US and UK liberated the victims and the people in the camps, in the concentration camps. And then my mother said to him, John, don't do that. He will be terrified for life with these memories, seeing those skeletons coming out of the camps. And my father said, that's exactly what I want. I want him to remember this. So 5 years old, I was marked by memories and by horrible pictures of what war actually means. And I think subconsciously, ever since, I have had this obsession with working for peace and working against wars that cause such enormous suffering.
I mean, what, in your opinion, Mr. Ambassador, you were born before the Second World War. You came to see the aftermath of the Second World War. I mean, what was the post-World War II? If we can kind of just center this conversation, what happened after the Second World War in terms of multilateralism, in terms of countries? We started with the League of Nations after World War I. That didn't work, right? We then have a United Nations is started after the horrors of the Second World War. Mr. Ambassador, can you speak to what was the theory behind all this multilateralism that came in the years following the Second World War, sir?
Well, Brian, in order to give a fair picture of what the world wanted to see after 1945, we have to realize that the period, I would say from 1930 to 1945, is one of the darkest chapters in human history. If you add up the Stalinist practices in terms of his opposition, but also towards Ukraine at the time, if you add up the fascism that grew out of in Germany and in Italy and in Japan, and then you saw the outbreak of the Second World War and the enormous loss of human life. It was the first war that ever had a majority of civilians killed. All wars before that were mostly military that died. But this was also, of course, the genocide war period and the beginning of the ethnic factors playing a role in world politics. So here we are, this enormously dark picture. And in an interesting way, as you know, history goes in waves. And when we had gone through that Second World War and seen the horrors, there was I would say, an outbreak of idealism, an outbreak of finally getting these horrors behind us. So we had this fantastic work of preparation for the United Nations, which started actually in 1942 already. But, some of the best lawyers and politicians met in San Francisco in May and June to 1945, and they wrote a beautiful charter. I think everything is just perfect except perhaps the veto rights, but we'll come back to that.
Sure.
And then you had later on the different institutions being growing up, the Human Rights Declaration 48, you had the Geneva Conventions, you had the World Trade Organizations, you had the defense organizations, NATO and so forth, European Union, which then was called Coal and Steel Union. The word together became the most important word. We realized that security and actually prosperity also built on working together and finding well-functioning international systems. And I studied and I got a good education, and for me, then it was natural around 1960 when I graduated, first to do my military service as a Navy officer, but then to try to enter after university and master's degree, to enter the foreign service, because I wanted really to serve for Sweden, giving peace research and peace building and peacekeeping priority. And this was sort of the driving element for my generation at the time, and also colleagues that had driven by the same desire all over in the Western democracies that I worked with. I was posted in France, in Germany, in the United States. And I felt that we were on a wave of positive developments. We had the 1975 meeting in Helsinki, which was the beginning of the end of the Cold War. And we saw the wall tumble down 1989, of course. And then there was hope that we would find a way of actually coexisting in the East and West. And we would, of course, always hoping that democracy and freedom would be the guiding principles for us. I lived with that spirit, I must say. If I look back at these many years, I lived in that spirit all my life until only 5, 6, maybe 10 years ago, when I saw the system started to shake, and where there is the mistrust entered the system, and where the system was undermined gradually. And I think we will come to this subject later on in our discussion.
Yeah, why don't we, and that's what really, I want to say that the understanding from 1945 to 1989, there really was a sense, because there was this common enemy, right? At least in the US, at least in the West, in regards to the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, you have this so-called peace dividend. And in the United States, particularly in the 1990s, you start hearing a lot more about unilateralism. Do we really need the UN? Does the UN do anything, right? And so you had a whole generation of people who came up after the horrors of the Second World War, who knew nothing really about it personally. Obviously, they read about it, but they didn't experience it. And there was then September 11th. And after September 11th, Iraq War. And then you start seeing unilateralism really becoming the sort of standard American foreign policy in terms of strategy. How do you think, can you explain this? So the US is a guarantor of the global system. Yet beginning in the early 21st century to today, it has done many things to undermine that same system. Can you speak to that disconnect in how that complicates the idea of let's say, a peace among at least great powers?
Well, I think the period from, let's say, Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, later Russia, and then with the Western powers, that period from 1989 until about 2007, 8 or so, was a period of great hope, where we were working together on a number of issues. We had less of vetoes in the Security Council. There was the beginning of a more free society in the Soviet Union, Russia. We were hoping that democracy will prevail all over, and that would also have effects on the security system in the world, and that we would avoid this classic Cold War grip of international politics that we had seen during that whole period, where it's like a wet blanket over international politics. And I recall conversations with Russian foreign ministers who actually, in the beginning, joked about joining European Union and even NATO coming together with the Soviet Union. And that was not really a joke. I mean, there was an ambition to go in that direction. And even the beginning of Putin's period was a period where Putin was interested in closing ranks with Western powers. But then something happened. It was a combination of problems in the Eastern European countries who were wanting to be absolutely free from Russia, even parts of the Soviet Union, which had independence movements. And then, of course, the reaction in Moscow on NATO enlargement and the reunification of Germany, which was a little bit of a sore, not a little bit, a big sore in the relationship, and which caused a lot of suspicion, not least with Putin, I guess, in the beginning of 2000s. And then came the developments around Georgia with Saakashvili and the fighting around Georgia and Abkhazia. And then we had a Munich Security Conference meeting in 2007. I wasn't there, but my colleagues tell me that Putin had an ice-cold speech at the time, a warning about a new trend, and that Russia would not go along with the Western NATO alliance taking over more and more, or other countries joining in the Eastern Europe. And there was a bitter tone coming in. And then, of course, it became worse and worse until 2014, when I was in Kiev, by the way. I was then Deputy Secretary General, and I was sent by the Security Council and Secretary General to Kiev after a Security Council meeting in March. I think it was the 1st of March 2014, and I was sent off the following day to Kiev in order to strengthen the UN presence, not only in Ukraine, but also in Ukraine proper, but of course also Crimea, which was then part of, and still is, of course, part of Ukraine. But we were met, our group, with violence, more or less, hooligans who chased my people back from the airport. And only days afterwards, the small green man moved in, and then we saw the annexation of Crimea, and then we saw actually a war that started 2014. People think about the war starting 2022, but no, it started 2014. And that shows
before Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah. So now it's a lot. It's a story of a growing mistrust, and from the great powers side, a growing, I would say, neglect of the existing system that we had built up 1945 onwards. A growing disrespect, I would say. A growing tendency, which today I would say almost is like a system of dependence on one great power in one region, and where you have Russia, of course, claiming that Ukraine is part of their sphere of interest, and where United States declares that Venezuela and Panama and Canada and Greenland are part of,
Right.
of their sphere of interest, which means that they give themselves some type of authority to exercise power over the international system, which is built on, let's say, principles like sovereignty and territorial integrity. And that has become one of the worst parts of today's political life. I, as a traditional diplomat, but also with some political experience, I've never experienced a period where international law is so strongly neglected, and where the great powers, particularly Russia and US, claim that they have the right to exercise their power. And then we come back to the line that you, Brian, know very well about: right is might, might is right.
Yeah. And why is that? Let me ask you this, Mr. Ambassador. Why is might makes right? I mean, it seems very obvious, but if you can make this clear, why is might make right a bad way for a global civilization to operate?
Well, you can see the consequences when you exercise that power, and Putin is standing there watching something that he believed was a military operation of 5 days turning into a horrible, unnecessary, cruel, dangerous war for 5 years.
Yeah.
Or Trump, whether he sees it or not, I hope he does, at least his colleagues and diplomats would see it, have lost so much of the quality of solidarity and loyalty inside an alliance. When you do this to Canada, and you see Carney's and the people of Canada's reactions, you see Denmark, our friends on the south side of Sweden, south of Sweden, who are allied or having done, a very close relationship, and actually see Greenland as part of a Danish kingdom, as long as the Greenlanders want so, but they certainly don't want another country to more or less grab it. And that's why it's so obvious that good international cooperation is actually, I would say, an enlightened self-interest.
Yeah.
I would say generally that international cooperation is generally an enlightened self-interest, because we live in a strange way of almost contempt of UN and international rules and international cooperation. When it's actually the people who live with that belief who are the realists. Standing alone leads basically in the end to isolation and distrust. And right now we have a dangerous lack of trust inside, for instance, the NATO alliance. And the other day when you saw the move from the side of the US vis-a-vis North Korea, you ask yourself what happens to the relationship.
And I want to speak to that, Mr. Ambassador. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, you've met a number of U.S. presidents, right? You obviously know U.S. foreign policy pretty well. I'm assuming you have an understanding of what sort of is acceptable left in left and right. As a diplomat, and particularly someone very senior at the UN, how does hearing the President of the United States praise North Korea's dictator while also derogating South Korea?
Well, here is almost, I think, a psychological dimension that I need to point to.
Right.
which occurs sometimes when people come into power, particularly when they come into power in a great nation with military capacity and size and economic influence and so forth, is that you think that you can you have a sort of admiration for strength, and the strength that you yourself can exercise, and you have an admiration for others who exercise strength, and you almost develop some type of community of a sort of comradeship between themselves.
Yeah.
So when you see that, Putin and Trump meet in Alaska and in very good spirits, and in the meantime you notice that the support to Ukraine, which is natural to almost all Europeans, and it's a survival issue not only for Ukraine but I think also in the end for Europe. When you see that this sort of comradeship and the admiration of strength and the strongman syndrome is being adopted, then there are no limits to it. Then you end up also admiring power exercised by people who are far away from any behavior that is based on democracy and international norms, like North Korea. So you have a very strange psychological dimension in today's international politics that you need to take into account.
Mr. Ambassador, can you explain to the audience how NATO and how Sweden's neighbor Denmark how United States, the perception of the United States has really changed, particularly as it relates to President Trump's rhetoric regarding Greenland, and how that's sort of poisoned the relationship. If you can really speak to that. I don't know how much Americans have heard how this is being perceived, particularly in European Union, in NATO, obviously Denmark.
Well, I think Americans should really realize how deeply this has affected not only Denmark, but particularly the Nordic and Baltic countries, and also, I think, also created a European solidarity around the request to more or less annex Greenland from the side of President Trump. In the beginning, it wasn't taken seriously, I can tell you. But we understood from our Danish friends and colleagues that it was certainly a serious issue, and it has come back, and it's still coming back. But I also want to tell you that I belong to the school of thought that we should be very firm and not try to ingratiate ourselves when there are these important principles at stake. But I can't criticize colleagues who see how they are affected by reactions that are negative in the eyes of the president of the United States, and they choose a more lenient, more positive, not sort of accepting and tolerant way of dealing with this in order to not make the situation worse. These two ways of behavior are being discussed with people on the harsh side, like Carney in Canada, and I would say the Danish Prime Minister, and on the other side you have the Secretary General of the NATO, who needs to keep the NATO together.
Right.
And I would even also, my own country has been rather low key because they still don't want to abandon the belief that NATO will stick together. And of course, most Europeans believe and hope that in the future will be a return to a transatlantic link of some strength. But right now it is torn, and it is it is really been under strong strain, not only because of the Greenland thing for us in the Nordic area, but also we follow the developments around Canada very closely, because that's also a NATO ally. And my friends in Canada and in Denmark, they are sad and angry because both these countries have been so much in solidarity with the United States. They have had people killed. The Danes were more or less in the front lines in Afghanistan. And Canada is a classic ally of US. And so what we hope is, of course, that this capital of confidence between us and trust and sympathy will not disappear. We have to, therefore, retain some type of hope that we will come back to normality. But it's been a long strain now, and it seems to continue. And we are so dependent on what direction American politics and foreign policy go.
And it's sort of it's almost very unfair, is that the entire really global civilization really depends on what some swing counties in a number of swing states in the United States, how they vote. That determines the trajectory of the United States and hence the world. So that's so I think there's a lot of conversations to be had about democratic reform, obviously in the United States. Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned the destruction of U.S. aid, and particularly when we spoke about President George W. Bush with PEPFAR and his good work in terms of helping mitigate the HIV crisis. Can you speak to the promise of U.S. aid, maybe your understanding of it, and in reality, how the destruction of it has probably undermined U.S. soft power significantly?
Well, I was, as you said in the beginning, which was the presentation that was very generous and a reminder of my age. Thank you very much. But you said that I had served as the first Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs. I was the first emergency relief coordinator. And we had at that time the horrors in Somalia and Sudan and Myanmar. And I can tell you that we wouldn't have survived. We wouldn't have been able to work without the solid support from the United States for humanitarian action. Tom Pickering was the ambassador at the time. He was fully behind this initiative to create the humanitarian mandate for the UN. But it wasn't only that. It was also the support, very generous support to the very important agencies, which to me are the UN as much as the UN in New York. You can't just neglect to say that they are irrelevant, because they are so enormously important in the field. UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNICEF for the children, the World Food Program, absolutely vital even now today, of course. And other organizations that were out there in the field. When I sometimes lose a little bit of my optimism about the UN, then I go out in the field and I come back strengthened, because I see these thousands of people serving the UN. And by the way, many of them are being killed. You know that 1,000 UN humanitarian workers have been killed in 3 years. Last year was almost 400, mostly in Gaza. But anyway, so I would say that the aid that was now cut off so drastically was it was a blow, an enormous blow. I have reports from my friends who called me in New York who overnight had to close an activity and leave. And it was like they were deserting something in great urgency.
In the dead of night.
And I would say millions of people are paying the price. I don't know how many are dying, but it has really meant the difference between life and death. And unfortunately, I must say, Europe has also cut down their budgets for development assistance in particular. And much money goes to migration projects and less to fighting poverty. So, of course, the reduction hasn't been as drastic as the American. But I hear from New York, and particularly my friend Tom Fletcher, who runs this humanitarian organization now, that the US is coming back slowly and have given recently $1.8 billion to humanitarian programs. I hope that there is a realization of the damage done and that you repair that as soon as possible. And I hope very much the US Congress, with a lot of congressmen and senators that I know personally since my time as ambassador, who solidly have been behind international cooperation. And you should know that US has lost a lot of strong standing and prestige in particularly the developing world, Africa, Asia, and Latin America, because of this.
Let me, Mr. Ambassador, you were an exchange student, my understanding, in the United States as a younger man. I'm curious how that experience, how this experience when you lived here, how that affected your view of the United States and the American people.
Well, you wouldn't believe it. I was 17 years old when I met John F. Kennedy. I was living in a home where the father, an optometrist, was chair of the Democratic Party of Adams County. It was Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Decatur. And he was pretty powerful in the Democratic Party. And I persuaded him, actually as a student, reading the New York Times, we had the Sunday edition coming to our home. And I had read about Kennedy. This was 2 years before the election, 1960. And I told him that this is the man for the future. You should really invite him for the Jefferson-Jackson dinner in Indianapolis. And he said, no, he speaks English in the same snobbish way as you do. So no way, I have Estes Kefauver. He was sort of a benign populist. But he couldn't come, Estes Kefauver. And then I reminded him as a negotiator at that time. Remember what you said, you should invite him if Estes couldn't come. Okay, and then he was invited. And then in front of 500 people in Indianapolis, in March 1958, the master of ceremony says, "Jack, welcome to Indiana. And we can tell you one thing. You wouldn't have been in this room if it hadn't been for this Swedish exchange student." So I was called up and was sitting with him on the podium for a while and talking. And I became a great admirer of him. And that was the beginning of a passionate life of interest in the United States. I was there as first secretary during the Vietnam War and during the Watergate crisis. And then I was in different functions in Sweden, always visiting US. And I was 5 years ambassador. My wife finds that was the best period of our whole diplomatic life. I partly agree. That's why I must say, rather sad that we have seen these developments, and I hope to God that you get back on track. You know, the shock of the 6th of January events was so big on all of Europe, and particularly those of us who have a background in living in the US and having American friends and feeling close. My own daughter is an American citizen. She lives in Washington, D.C., and she is part of America. And we have a branch of my family now that will go out in your country. So much of our aspirations and hope is, of course, that U.S. will play that role that we are used to see, but that we do it in a spirit of loyalty and cooperation and respect of what our great predecessors as diplomats did, starting from 1945, building up this system. I myself was negotiating Human Rights Council, Peace Building Council, a number of institutions that are the JCPOA. I was working with John Kerry and Zarif and Mogherini and others on that agreement. I went to Iran to persuade the Iranians to go on to agree to the agreement, which then was abandoned 2018.
In the first Trump administration.
Yeah. So that's why we see now, and U.S. has left the Human Rights Council, and you have left the World Health Organization, a number of institutions which are necessary for a really solid international cooperation. So we just put our hopes in seeing U.S. back and working together in mutual respect.
How has the war? On February 28th, 2026, President Donald Trump chose to attack Iran, start a military conflict that has continued to this day and has had significant geostrategic economic effects. I mean, looking at this, how is the U.S. war on Iran, the U.S.-Israel war on Iran, how is that being interpreted by U.S. traditional partner and allies? Right now, you have the president who is saying, well, if South Korea won't come to Iran, then we're, and then he praises North Korea. And part of this, I think, Mr. Ambassador, part of this question is you can't be mean to your friends and allies and then expect them to help you when you need them. But also, there's also the question of how are we being perceived, right? Because the U.S. sort of has this reputation for being the guarantor, perceived as a guarantor, but right now we're not able to have any strategic real victory in Iran. So how is that? How do you think that possibly is perceived overseas, particularly countries that are friends with us or were friends with us, but particularly adversaries who are watching what's happening in Iran, who are watching the trouble the United States is having, reopening the Strait of Hormuz and sort of this geostrategic catastrophe. Mr. Ambassador, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. Well, I believe that we have two completely unnecessary, dangerous wars going on right now, Ukraine and Iran. Wars of choice, and wars that certainly should not have started. I even believe that the leadership in Moscow are wondering what they did, what they started, and they are paying a very heavy price, and everybody realizes that there are no winners in these types of war. And basically, my own experience is that there are no winners of war. I mediated in the Iran-Iraq War that went on for 8 years. We finally negotiated ceasefire in 1988. Both countries still pay a price for that war. It's still like an old wound that hasn't healed. And now this war in Iran, I mean, it was clearly mostly Israel that pushed this issue on Trump, and he started this war, and he thought this also would be a short-time war. He was warned, I believe, and I hear also from inside the administration, the diplomats warned about the Hormuz factor and the size of the country, and the fact that they had some type of resilience after 8 years of bloody war with Iraq. With losses. They were really battle scarred and prepared for a long war. And the regime also had built up a structure which was almost indestructible, because they had replacement from every level if there was any losses from internal or external sources. So that war, when it started, became so dangerous, and also it became dangerous for the world, because the Iranians, of course, used their advantage of control of the Hormuz Strait together with Oman. And I'm a Navy officer, so I believe basically this is extremely wrong, that the free navigation is being hindered, and that they create a dangerous precedent We see the Houthis doing the same now, and the Bab el-Mandeb and the Suez Canal will be affected. And you can look around the map, and there are at least 10 spots where countries can play that game once we started. So, but I guess that was their only card, and there's still their only card to play, their main card to play. And they will then, of course, in the end realize that they would not be able to do shipping from their own country, which is, of course, a lifeline to the outside. Much more so than, I think, for the Gulf countries who can organize land transportation with the financial means they have. So basically, I would say this was seen with the start of that war was something that most European countries reacted to. It was against international law. It was against Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. It wasn't self-defense at the time. There was also the hope of a regime change, but I mean, looking back at the situation, looking at the situation now, it's almost the contrary effect. The liberal forces and the forces that would start a movement to democracy, which one day will come, of course, they are in a weaker position now. And I think the patriotism has grown when their own country's whole future is at stake and where even complete destruction is being threatened. So therefore, this has caused further strains on Europe. You see the relationship between Spain and Italy even, and the US, who haven't allowed full use of bases. And the public opinion in Europe is very much against, because we see also that this is connected very much to Israel and what Israel is doing in Gaza and West Bank and Lebanon, and where I think they have to finally introduce some type of restraint in their policy. You can't develop a security policy which is based on military power exercised without any proportionality to effects, as we have seen in that case. And with the US, of course, feeling, I see some regrets. I saw an interview in the New Yorker with Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan. But they expressed remorse. About allowing Israel to go so far. We should have been more tougher with Israel at the earlier stage. They say now, and I think the same thing is around the thinking in the administration. And I hope that in the enlightened self-interest that Israel will realize that in the end you can't build your security policy mainly on military power and use of military power for a long time.
Mr. Ambassador, curious. The internet. This is maybe a different question, but the internet, when it was rolled out, we have now universal communication, instant communication. We're enjoying the fruits of the internet now. At the same time, you also have this sort of information space that has, I think, undermined democracies significantly. Do you have any thoughts on internet, social media, and how it's been used in a lot of ways to undermine societies that respect freedom of speech and respect freedom of conscience, right? But essentially, it's being weaponized to undermine democracies from within. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, I welcomed internet when it came in the late 80s and early 90s. I thought that was a great part of knowledge expansion and awareness of the enormous amounts of knowledge and wisdom that you find in everything printed and every discussion taking place. I thought it was I thought it would be a democratic tool in connection with if you connected that to breaking the illiteracy in the world and sharing riches and so forth. It was maybe idealistic. But I must say I have been growingly skeptical about where it has developed. I think it has done so much to take away the sharp line between truth and lies and competition between facts, evidence-based facts, and produced facts, alternative facts.
Alternative facts, yeah.
As the spokesperson of Trump said in the beginning of the first term.
Kellyanne Conway, yeah.
Yeah, that was the... But it has also then led to a brutalization of the political language. We have a political campaign going on in Sweden for an election in 3 weeks' time, and some of the excesses on the social media are horrifying.
Yeah,
and not only on the media, but taken over by different organizations, different parties, and by that leading to a split. A deeper split between people in a small, rich, well-functioning country like Sweden. And what is mostly called polarization, of course, but it's almost overused term. But I think I'm very much afraid of that, because I grew up from a poor working class environment, but with a development which was based on cooperation between, enterprises and business sector and unions and civil society and cooperation in consumerism. It was just an enormous amounts of great together institutions.
Sort of an equilibrium.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And the whole idea was that you found a way of negotiating, and where you had an agreement to give and take. But now it's extremes, even in diplomacy. I feel diplomacy now is almost an endangered species, or at least living in very bad conjuncture, very difficult. Because if you have a war, normally you find some type of compromise in the end. But now it's either you not only defeat, but you annihilate.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the same goes in debates and the way we communicate. So I am afraid that with this development where the word is not living in sanctity as it should, and the collection of word and the beauty of nuances of words disappears. So I believe we need some type of mobilization of humanism and to go back to a sensitive, calm way of communicating and listening to each other and evaluating and judging the quality of the type of arguments being presented. When there are lies, they should be condemned and they should be banned, and that should lead to consequences to use them. But now you can even get elected on lies, and you don't mind.
Yeah. I mean, Mr. Ambassador, we began this interview talking about you talked about the 1930s as one of the darkest eras of human time, of human history. Right now, they're in sort of during the 1930s, you had the Spanish Civil War. In some ways, Ukraine is sort of analogous to the Spanish Civil War, because you have you have Russia attacking Ukraine, but also you have all these other powers also involved in different levels, but they are training the next sort of level of warfare, right? So it's AI, it's robotics, it's sensors, it's way beyond the dangers of World War II. But now we see that there are parties, for instance, in Russia versus Ukraine, you have Iran helping Russia with drones. You have North Korean soldiers going to invade Ukraine. You have China, which is helping finance the war. You have Belarus, which has essentially been annexed, right? And then you have the U.S. attacking Iran, and you have Russia giving Iran U.S. targeting information. At the same time, Trump is saying Taiwan's security is negotiable. And so I guess to kind of tie this all together, there is a sense that there's a gathering storm right now. And I'm curious if you think that's a fair interpretation, given the factors I gave you, where we could be heading towards a global conflict between great powers in a way similar to the Second World War, where you had wars between Nazi Germany, you had United States, Nazi Germany, you had Imperial Japan, you had USSR, horrific violence. What is going on in Ukraine is called the kill zones, is horrific violence. Mr. Ambassador, do you worry that this could all merge into a global conflagration?
Well, I can't tell you that I sometimes become pretty pessimistic. I usually call myself a worried optimist, but sometimes I fall into another category. I am a pessimist who has not given up.
Yeah.
And I circle between these two. I see huge dangers. I see very dark clouds pretty close by and in the horizon. I still think that in the end, the great powers will realize that they need to work with others, and that they are weaker if they are alone, that isolation is weakening, and that is in fact in the end dangerous. I believe that international law is the first line of defense for small and medium-sized countries, but actually for all in the end. And I believe that deep differences in terms of economic and social conditions are dangerous and lead to huge crisis. And I believe that war is such a stupid idea.
Yeah.
Wars, I have been mediating in 6 conflicts, 3 wars, and then a humanitarian crisis. And I can't remember any really winner. I mean, they are paying the price in terms of poverty and hatred and divisions, or ethnic divisions, and whatever, for a long time. I just gave the example of Iran-Iraq.
There's no one wins. Wins.
Wars don't deliver any victories. It's they call it victories, but they aren't victories. But what I really gives me most hope now in a sort of political life, although I find hope in other areas like nature and culture and my friends, and my family and friends, and my dog and my tennis. But what really gives me hope now is that Europe should shape up. And Europe should stand for its own security. And we are strengthening our security. And we should be we should really be loyal and be at the side of Ukraine in a situation where the United States hasn't decided really what side they will end up on. So on the security side, Europe has an enormous responsibility, but deeper is that we are perhaps in Europe now the bastion for democracy.
Yeah.
if we see the strains on democracy in the United States and parts of Europe, then we realize that we still have the major actors in the area of democracy in our continent. And we should be proud to stand up for a Europe which is strengthening itself and helping Ukraine defend itself, and also stand up fully for democracy. I wish that we would have been more active in the Middle East, because the countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are critical that we have double standards on international law. We are very firm on Russia and Ukraine and less firm on Israel in the Middle East, although I'm the first one to condemn Gaza, condemn Hamas and Hezbollah. But Europe is my hope. And then I can tell you, here at home, we have a homegrown optimism, because the Nordic countries, the 5 Nordic countries, now for the first time in history, have the same security policy. Sweden and Finland were neutral and non-aligned for my country 200 years, more than 200 years. And the Russian invasion and aggression against Ukraine made us come to the conclusion, including the left side of the political spectrum, to join NATO. And we did. And the fact that we now, the 5 countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Iceland, have the same basic policy, shows that we can have a policy together inside NATO. For instance, on Greenland or the Arctic, or an international law, saying that international law is our first line of defense. And we will, I think, be straightening our back. And Jørgensen in Denmark has shown that we do so. We have been 100% loyal with her. Sweden even sent soldiers to Greenland for an exercise, which was meant to show solidarity with Denmark. So, yes, there is hope. And the more I speak, the more I land in being more of a worried optimist than a pessimist that has not given up. But we must never give up. That's my basic belief. I have worked all my life for this, and we must never give up the principles and the values that were at stake at the end of this horror period, 1930-45. I don't believe in those who say that the old system is gone and over. No, it's not being respected. We don't live up to it. You can't get much of a better charter, except for the veto, which we haven't had time to discuss. But we couldn't get a better charter. And our Human Rights Declaration is wonderful. And the Geneva Conventions are great. And the Refugee Convention is great. We just have to live up to it. And if we were to renegotiate these conventions now, in today's world, in today's climate of mistrust, we would end up with something much less effective than what we did from 1945 onwards.
Well, Ambassador Eliasson, it really was an honor to have you on History of the Present to discuss all these historical, political matters, and to discuss it with you. And I'll say, I'll give you the final word, Ambassador Eliasson. But you talked about optimism, right? And the importance of optimism in a time where it's easy to be pessimistic. And I was hopeful maybe we could end on that note in terms of maybe a final message to people watching this who are concerned about Ukraine, Taiwan, Israel, Palestine, all of the things that are happening today.
No, I would say that we must be realizing that the world must be seen in 2 perspectives. We must see the world as it is. And it's not a pretty place. And we have to be very sharp and very skilled in our analysis of what the world is. But 2, we must never forget the world as it should be. we must always strive to move from the world as it is to the world as it should be. Millimeter, centimeter, decimeter. We will realize that the whole meaning of active life, not only in diplomacy but everywhere, is to reduce the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And that requires an attitude that we simply never give up, because principles and values, you cannot compromise on them. They are there as a goal, as something to strive for. The realities down here is very flexible, up and down and muddy and sometimes good, sometimes bad, but you've got to have something to aim for. So if we then move in that direction and keep that line and add one more thing, namely to realize what is the most important word in the world today and for the future. That word is together. It's only together that we can manage. We haven't even managed, we haven't even talked about the existential issue of the environment and climate. But you remember, that's just one sign of how closely knit we are together, and that the word together is the only solution for practically every problem we have today. If I have survived at my age and still in pretty good shape, it's because I realized that I've had a crew. I have had people to trust. I have had wonderful colleagues and friends who've been up backing me, and I have been helping them. And the beauty of doing that together and see the results keep at least me going, and I'm sure also keep you going in your program and in your organization.
Mr. Ambassador Eliasson, it was an honor to have you here on History of the Present, produced with The Intellectualist and Lincoln Square. And we'd love to have you back to talk about all of these issues. We talked about democratic erosion, the UN, human rights, the ideal versus the actual. It's been an honor to have you here, sir, and look forward to speaking again.
Thank you very much, and good luck in what you